On October 3rd, China's Ministry of Commerce issued a statement expressing strong opposition to Mexico's Ministry of Economy launching 4 anti-dumping investigations on Chinese float glass, self-adhesive tapes, PVC-coated fabric, and steel bolts. A spokesperson for the ministry said that as of this year, Mexico has initiated 11 anti-dumping investigations on Chinese products, nearly double the total number of cases from last year. Prior to this, on September 10th, the Mexican government had submitted a tariff proposal to Congress, planning to impose tariffs as high as 50% on imports from China and other countries with which Mexico does not have a free trade agreement. This includes not only bulk commodities such as cars and parts, steel, and textiles, but also consumer goods like daily necessities, shoes, clothing, toys, and home appliances. The bill submitted to Congress contains a tariff list for about 1,400 products, affecting imports worth $52 billion, or 8.6% of Mexico's total imports. Mexico's Ministry of Economy stated that this move would generate an additional $3.76 billion in annual tax revenue for the government and save 325,000 jobs in the industrial and manufacturing sectors. It's worth noting that this list, in addition to covering China, also includes other countries, mainly to prevent China from circumventing tariffs by transshipping goods through third countries. In this proposal, China's automotive industry has become the most affected sector. Mexico's Economy Minister Ebrard stated that Mexico currently imposes a 20% tariff on imported cars from Asia. However, due to the significantly lower import price of Chinese cars compared to the reference price, Mexico is considering raising the tariff on Chinese car imports to the maximum level of 50%, which is allowed by the World Trade Organization. According to a report by Japanese consulting firm Mark Lines, Chinese brand cars accounted for 30% of the total car imports in Mexico in 2023, with a market share of approximately 20% in the light vehicle market. According to the China Association of Automobile Manufacturers, Mexico became China's largest export destination for cars in the first half of this year, with exports reaching 235,000 units, a 31% year-on-year increase. This tariff adjustment will not only affect Chinese brands such as BYD and Great Wall, but also international automakers like General Motors, Ford, and Kia, whose vehicles produced in China will face price increases, weakening their competitiveness in Mexico. Industry experts have long pointed out that the long-term investments of U.S. automakers in China have significantly enhanced the CCP's manufacturing capability, while also deepening the economic ties between U.S. corporations and the Chinese economy, leading to a loss of many U.S. jobs. One of President Trump's strategic goals was to impose heavy taxes on U.S.-produced models in China to encourage the return of manufacturing to the U.S. The Mexican government's actions are undoubtedly aligned with Trump's direction. If the proposal is approved, the related measures are expected to come into full effect by December 31, 2026 at the earliest. The CCP has reacted strongly to this. In retaliation, on September 25th, China's Ministry of Commerce announced a trade and investment barrier investigation into Mexico's measures restricting trade with China. Meanwhile, the CCP launched an anti-dumping investigation into imported pecans originating from Mexico and the United States. A spokesperson from China's Ministry of Commerce stated that, against the backdrop of the U.S. increasing tariffs, Mexico's unilateral tax increases, even if in line with WTO frameworks, would harm the interests of all parties, including China. Trade between China and Mexico has maintained rapid growth. According to data from China's General Administration of Customs, the bilateral trade volume between China and Mexico reached $109.4 billion in 2024. Of this, China exported $90.2 billion to Mexico and imported only $19.2 billion, resulting in a significant trade deficit. Automobiles are a major export from China, and Chinese investment in automotive parts in Mexico has surged, reaching $12.7 billion in 2024, a year-on-year increase of over 50%. Chinese e-commerce platforms are also deeply entrenched in the Latin American market, with Mexico holding a 26% market share. Platforms such as Pinduoduo's Temu, TikTok Shop, and Shein have rapidly expanded, and the number of Chinese sellers on Amazon's Latin America platform grew by over 80% year-on-year. Some observers point out that the series of trade restrictions Mexico has introduced against China is a result of U.S. pressure on North American partners to align with the U.S. In early September, Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum met with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, after which the Mexican tariff proposal was unveiled. Additionally, the timing of this proposal coincided with the launch of the 2026 review negotiations of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement. All three countries have opened public consultation periods, Mexico with a 60-day window, the U.S. with 45 days, and a public hearing scheduled for November 15th, and Canada from August through October. The U.S. Strategic and International Studies Center analyzed that the review may evolve into renegotiation, focusing on rules of origin, regional security, and labor enforcement, all of which are closely related to China. Compared to its predecessor, the North American Free Trade Agreement, the USMCA significantly tightens localization requirements for the automotive industry, raises wage thresholds, and aims to limit the dumping of Chinese auto parts into North America. U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai has warned that some countries, such as China, assemble products in Mexico, take advantage of USMCA benefits to enter the U.S. market, but shoulder no obligations. Bloomberg reports that Washington has urged North American partners to synchronize their trade barriers against China. Mexico's tariff increase is clearly intended to gain leverage in the review process. For Mexico, exports to the U.S. account for over 90% of total exports, and the outcome of the review is crucial for economic stability and the political future of Sheinbaum's ruling party, Morena. If negotiations go poorly, it may lead to adjustments in the agreement, a shortened review cycle, or a split into bilateral agreements, forcing Mexico to make concessions. Professor Sun Kuo-sheng of the Department of Economics at Southern Taiwan University stated that Mexico's decision to raise tariffs on 1,400 products from China and other Asian countries reflects a dual consideration of responding to U.S. pressure and protecting domestic employment. In March, the Mexican government proposed the North American Fortress concept, aiming to impose tariffs on Chinese goods similar to those in the U.S., and calling on Canada to adopt similar measures to prevent Chinese goods from flowing into the North American market through Mexico and Canada. He further analyzed, Mexico is a key hub in the U.S. offshore outsourcing and USMCA production network. The U.S. is concerned that China may circumvent North American markets by investing or transshipping through Mexico, and thus continues to pressure Mexico to strengthen rules of origin and control points. Recent signs indicate that Mexico is more inclined to adjust policies to align with the North American supply chain and U.S. security concerns. The Financial Times reported that the CCP has launched a comprehensive investigation into Mexico's tariff increases on Chinese goods and other trade restrictions. This move is seen as one of Beijing's major steps to block third countries from cooperating with the U.S. to curb trade with China. U.S. economist Davy J. Wong stated that the CCP's retaliatory investigation is essentially a systemic counterattack against Mexico's recent taxation of Chinese goods and a clear message to other countries. Standing with the U.S. comes with a cost. He said, Beijing's dissatisfaction with Mexico stems from both economic and strategic concerns. Mexico has long benefited from Chinese investment and trade, and now, under U.S. pressure, betrays China. This has prompted Beijing to launch retaliatory investigations. Regarding the ongoing U.S.-China strategic rivalry, Wang believes that, although China and the U.S. have reached temporary agreements on areas like TikTok and technology, tensions continue to escalate in traditional manufacturing, subsidies, tariffs, and other sectors. Mexico happens to be a key hub in the U.S.-China rivalry, crucial for nearshore manufacturing, the flow of goods, and chemical supply chains. On future developments, Professor Sun predicts three possible scenarios. China will maintain pressure through trade barrier investigations and selective retaliation while seeking technical exemptions or adjustments through thresholds. Mexico will solidify the tariff framework during the congressional and budgetary processes while retaining execution flexibility, and the US and China will likely handle cases like TikTok separately, but overall, there will be continued strategic rivalry and friction escalation in the automotive, electric vehicle, and critical materials sectors. Wang pointed out that Mexico is both a key trade partner for the CCP in Latin America and a potential transit point for Chinese goods entering the North American market. In the eyes of the US, it is also one of the sources of the drug crisis. The US may limit Chinese goods flowing into North America through Mexico via the USMCA or other measures, or use economic incentives to pull Mexico closer. On the same day the CCP announced it would impose tariffs on Mexico and initiate an investigation, President Trump declared that, starting October 1st, the US would impose a 100% tariff on imported pharmaceuticals, a 50% tariff on kitchen and bathroom cabinets, and 30% and 25% tariff on soft upholstered furniture and heavy trucks, respectively. He added that companies that have started pharmaceutical plant construction in the US will be exempted. White House Trade Advisor Peter Navarro stated on September 26 that the new tariffs aim to reduce US dependence on Chinese manufacturing, encourage the return of supply chains to the US, and protect national security through tough trade policies. When explaining the reason behind the pharmaceutical tariffs, he cited an example. A Chinese company, after receiving FDA approval for antibiotics, invested in an Indian company, forged contracts with the Department of Veteran Affairs, and squeezed US domestic manufacturers. He said, "Those are the kinds of things we're having to deal with, and that's why the tariffs are so necessary." Regarding Mexico's escalation of trade restrictions on China, there has been a surge of outcry and threats from self-media accounts with official backgrounds on China's Douyin platform. Phrases like, "Mexico has yielded to Trump," "China retaliates strongly," "Mexico should be very cautious," and "the consequences of angering China are severe," have flooded the platform. Analysts point out that Beijing has long placed great importance on Mexico. Its geographic advantage, bordering the US, makes Mexico the most important foothold for the CCP to wage an undeclared war against the US. For years, Beijing has meticulously built influence in Mexico through large-scale investments and trade relations, gradually infiltrating local politics. This influence extends beyond the economic realm, infiltrating deeper social and criminal areas. The CCP has not only used economic leverage to influence Mexico's policymaking, but also established close ties with local drug cartels. By helping these groups launder money and providing precursor chemicals for fentanyl and other drugs, the CCP has gradually taken control of Mexico's criminal networks, which it, in turn, uses to interfere with Mexico's political situation. This strategy has become a major threat from the CCP to the United States, with drugs and illegal trade serving as invisible weapons. Meanwhile, the US government has maintained a tough stance on Mexico's criminal cartels. From the construction of the border wall to joint law enforcement operations, the US has continuously pressured the Mexican government to cooperate in dismantling drug cartels. Against this backdrop, Mexico's recent decision to impose tariffs of up to 50% on Chinese goods is undoubtedly a clear statement through trade policy. In the confrontation between the US and the CCP drug cartel alliance, Mexico has chosen to stand with the US. This decision is not only an economic adjustment, but also a geopolitical signal, marking Mexico's shift away from the CCP influence toward closer cooperation with the US. Mexico's tariff on Chinese goods will have three major effects, each directly impacting the CCP's global strategic layout. First, the channel for Chinese goods to be transshipped into the US via Mexico will be cut off. This was the last and most crucial backup route for the CCP after its transshipment trade in Southeast Asia faced precise strikes from US Customs and Border Protection. Since the US-China trade war began under the Trump administration in 2018, the US has imposed multiple rounds of tariffs on Chinese goods, forcing the CCP to find alternative routes. Initially, the CCP used Southeast Asian countries, such as Vietnam and Thailand, as transit stations. However, CBP has gradually closed these loopholes through enhanced supply chain tracking and anti-circumvention investigations. In contrast, Mexico, as a member of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, enjoys a superior geographical position and trade advantages. In recent years, Chinese companies have established factories in Mexico where semi-finished products are brought in, assembled into finished goods, and then labeled as made in Mexico for entry into the US market. This route not only circumvented US tariffs on Chinese goods, but also took advantage of Mexico's low labor costs and proximity to the US for logistics. However, Mexico's 50% tariff will significantly increase the cost of Chinese goods, making this route unprofitable. As a result, the CCP's trade circumvention strategy will face total collapse, and US supply chain security will be strengthened. This will affect industries such as electronics and automotive parts. It could potentially lead to a global supply chain reshuffle, prompting more companies to bring production lines back to the US or relocate to other friendly countries. Second, the CCP's use of investment and transshipment trade in Mexico as a cover for its drug shipments to the US will be significantly undermined. Some fentanyl precursor chemicals are smuggled directly into the US through these transshipped goods from Mexico. For example, a container from China, labeled as industrial chemicals, might secretly contain fentanyl precursors. After entering Mexican ports, these are processed by drug cartels such as the Sinaloa cartel or the Jalisco New Generation cartel, and then smuggled across the border into the US. Mexico's tariff measures will increase the cost and risk of covering these shipments, forcing Chinese companies to reduce investments or withdraw. Meanwhile, the Mexican government may strengthen port inspections and supply chain regulation, further blocking this drug supply line. This effect will not only alleviate the US fentanyl crisis, but also weaken the CCP's ability to use drugs as a tool for asymmetric warfare. In the long term, it could prompt deeper cooperation between the US and Mexico on anti-drug efforts, such as expanding joint intelligence sharing and border patrols to combat this transnational threat. Third, some Chinese enterprises in Mexico also assist Mexican criminal cartels with money laundering activities. This network will suffer a major blow due to the tariffs. Chinese enterprises are not only trade outposts, but also serve as channels for financial laundering. The huge sums of cash that drug cartels acquire from the US market need to be converted into legal assets through complex money laundering mechanisms. CCP-controlled enterprises, such as certain bank branches or investment companies, use cross-border trade invoices, fake investments, and other methods to help cartels launder money. For example, a Chinese company might buy goods from a Mexican company at inflated prices, which in reality is meant to transfer illegal funds, or they might set up shell companies and conduct multiple transfers to hide the origin of the funds. These Chinese enterprises are often linked to the CCP's Belt and Road Initiative, investing in infrastructure projects in Mexico, such as ports and railways, while also providing logistical support to criminal groups. The tariff increase will sharply reduce the profits of Chinese enterprises, forcing them to scale back operations or withdraw from the market, thus cutting off the money laundering channels. This will not only strike at the financial foundation of the drug cartels, but also weaken the CCP's control over the Mexican economy. Mexico's significant tariff hike on Chinese goods will not only cool down the bilateral economic relationship, but will also weaken the CCP's support for Mexican drug cartels. As trade volume declines, the CCP's supply of precursor chemicals and financial aid will decrease, limiting the operational capability of the cartels. Meanwhile, the influence the CCP has exerted on the Mexican government through local criminal groups will also be greatly reduced. In the past, these groups served the CCP's interests by bribing officials or creating social unrest. Now, the Mexican government's stance will strengthen its domestic anti-corruption and anti-crime efforts. Since the Trump administration launched a trade war against China, Mexico's attitude towards China has been steadily changing. Initially, Mexico benefited from the US-China trade friction, becoming a safe haven for Chinese enterprises, attracting a large amount of investment. However, with the increased pressure from the US and the strict enforcement of USMCA rules, Mexico gradually realized the risks of over-relying on China. Before Mexico escalated trade restrictions against the CCP, the latter had already sensed this crisis and had used various methods to coerce and lure the Mexican government into changing its plans. For example, through diplomatic pressure, threats of economic retaliation, and even media propaganda to influence public opinion. But the final result shows that all of the CCP's tactics failed, and it can only resort to retaliatory measures to save face. The CCP is sparking fires all around the world, constantly opposing the US. In the eyes of the United States, Mexico is like a dagger pointed at its back. Yet for years, it had been held by the CCP. This is actually an extremely dangerous hidden risk. Border security, immigration issues, and the influx of drugs have all cost the US dearly. Now the situation has fundamentally changed. Mexico has clearly aligned itself with the US in the US-China showdown. This shift not only blocks the CCP's trade and drug routes, but also marks the complete collapse of the CCP's frontline position in its war against the US. In the future, the US may further strengthen its alliance with Mexico to jointly confront the CCP's global expansion. This event also provides a lesson for other countries. In the US-China rivalry, aligning with the US is a safer strategic path.